During the 90s, we saw the gap close between arcade games and the associated ports on home consoles. However, that being said, there was still a gap that needed to be addressed when handling the port. And even though these ports weren't always 100% clones, a lot of them were great versions of the games that we could play at home, and they would even add some features that the arcade didn't have in some cases. The 5 games chosen for this list aren't necessarily the games that match their arcade counterparts the closest from a technical standpoint. Otherwise, the Dreamcast would probably dominate this list. Rather, these are 5 games that I feel did a great job of converting an arcade experience into something fun to play at home and have in your collection. And with that, the first game I want to talk about is Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. This game was pretty much the perfect storm when it came to delivering on arcade dreams. It was essentially the Ninja Turtles game every kid always wanted at a time when the Ninja Turtles were super popular. The Ninja Turtles games for NES all had their merits, but this was finally a game that closely resembled the arcade. Not only that, but it even added an extra level and modified a couple others to make them improved if you ask me. The controls on the Super Nintendo version have always felt a little better to me as well. Not sure if that's just because I'm more used to it, but I've read that you can intentionally throw enemies at the screen as opposed to triggering it randomly in the arcade version, which matches up with the experience I've had. As far as visuals go, the Super Nintendo version doesn't look exactly like the arcade, but it does still look great. Really colorful and captures the fun spirit of the Ninja Turtles. The music takes advantage of the console's sound hardware as well, cranking out some of the system's most iconic songs. Perhaps the most notable thing missing from the home console version is the arcade's ability to play as all 4 turtles at once with a 4-player mode. Gotta be honest, that's pretty dang cool, but it's a little more fun in theory than it is in practice, only because it can make things pretty hectic and hard to track your character. Still, it's a nice option to have, but playing with just 2 players is a great experience regardless. Okay, next game on my list would be Virtua Cop 2 on the Sega Saturn. There's actually a lot of great light gun games that were ported to home consoles, but this game has always stood out to me for one specific reason: the light gun that you play it with. I think the Saturn Stunner is by far the best light gun for home consoles I've ever used due to the fact that it feels so substantial. It's so substantial that your arm can even get tired holding it up. Not to worry though, the easy solution to this is to just give your arm a little support with your other arm. There we go, that looks pretty cool, right? There was clearly an effort to make this thing more closely resemble the bulkier light guns you'd find at the arcade. That combined with the orange color that just screams the 90s, and you've got one of the best retro game accessories there is, in my opinion. As for the game itself, what I've always liked about Virtua Cop is that the enemies die from one shot. So it's more about timing, aim, and quick reactions than it is about hammering on the trigger. Not that that isn't fun as well, but it's just a fun alternative to have. You can play this game with 2 players, of course, and you definitely should if you're able to. Now, as far as playing the game with a regular controller goes, I definitely think it's more fun with the light gun, but it is still fun with the good old Saturn controller if that's your only option. And speaking of games that are great with a traditional Saturn controller, next up we've got X-Men vs. Street Fighter. What a game, I tell ya. This game got a lot of us excited back in the day when we'd see the arcade cabinets because it was 2 worlds colliding that most kids loved during that time. Heck, I wasn't even that big of an X-Men fan as a kid, and I still thought this was super cool. What's sad is that in the US, we only ever got the PlayStation 1 port, which is worse than the Saturn version for pretty much every possible reason you could imagine. Drastically cut frames of animation, way more loading required, and worst of all, the tag team function during fights was removed. You know, the main feature of the game? The Saturn version practically matched the arcade version. The Sega Saturn was certainly known for being a very capable system for 2D games, but this particular port still seemed like a miracle. Well, the Saturn utilized the special 4MB RAM card for this game that expanded the RAM from 2MB to 6MB, and it was put to great use. Talking about just a handful of megabytes might sound comical now, but it was a big deal back then and made all the difference. Oh, and also, just in case the PS1 version hasn't been kicked to the curb enough, what really cemented the Saturn version being great was the controller you'd play it with. The Saturn controller had a much better D-pad, the best D-pad ever if you ask me, as well as 6 face buttons, which were perfect for having your 3 punches on one row and your 3 kicks on the other row. Okay, but let's take a break from the Sega Saturn for a bit and talk about Sunset Riders. Yep, another Konami game ported to the Super Nintendo. Sure, it didn't have as many enhancements made to it as Turtles in Time, but it did make a key improvement over the one thing in the arcade version that bothers me, and that would be how you slide. You see, in the arcade you had to hold the arcade stick at a diagonal down angle and press the jump button in order to slide. If you don't hold it perfectly diagonal or perhaps mistime the press of the jump button, then you'll jump instead of sliding, which will almost definitely get you killed. With the Super Nintendo version, you have a dedicated button for sliding, and you just need to simply press that button along with whichever direction you want to go. Much better and more reliable. It may not seem like as big of a deal as I'm making it out to be, but trust me, this game is difficult and requires a lot of quick reflex evasive maneuvering to get away from the bullets. So it's really important that the controls be responsive and easy to use. The game itself has always been a favorite of mine, making it onto my list of best co-op games for the Super Nintendo. I just think the Western theme lends itself well to video games. Captures that arcade spirit of gameplay well, where it starts out easy enough to get you hooked and gets damn near impossible towards the later stages, requiring you to really get good and repeatedly play through it if you ever want to beat the game. Okay, last game on the list is Radiant Silvergun, yet another Sega Saturn game, and unfortunately it's also a Japan exclusive for the system. That's not too much of an issue nowadays though, with how easy it is to play Saturn imports. The simplest way is to just get an action replay cart and you're good to go. Anyways, this is one of those iconic games by the developer Treasure that took the shoot 'em up genre and turned it on its head. Because the game never had actual arcade cabinets in the US and gained so much popularity from the Saturn port, the game almost gets thought of more as a Sega Saturn game than it does as an actual arcade game. It ran on Sega's STV arcade hardware, which lucky for the Saturn was well equipped to port games from, resulting in a pretty faithful arcade port for the Sega Saturn. Not only that, but the Saturn's controller almost feels like it was designed for this game. There are 6 different weapons you can use, with each one corresponding to the 6 face buttons, as well as the right bumper button to use the famous sword mechanic in the game. Anyways, it was important for me to mention this game because people often don't think of it as an arcade port, and I think that's a testament to just how at home it feels on the Saturn. Oh, and it might be the greatest shoot 'em up ever made depending who you ask, so it has that going for it too. Alright, and so that does it for my top 5 arcade ports from the 90s. There's a ton of other great arcade ports, as well as 80s arcade games that had their ports released in the 90s, but I still just consider those to be 80s games. I'd love to hear what some of your favorite arcade ports are, in addition to which of the games I listed are ones that you enjoy. Of course, I'd also like to hear any other thoughts you may have. So be sure to leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.